I sat alone at the kitchen table, stirring the same cold cup of tea I'd made hours ago, letting the silence of the apartment settle around me like a heavy blanket. The kitchen lights were dimmed, casting soft shadows against the walls, and outside the city lights twinkled, as if mocking the quiet emptiness within my home. I remember a time when this place was vibrant and alive, filled with laughter and late-night conversations. But those days felt distant now, faded like an old photograph tucked away in a forgotten drawer. Suddenly the front door clicked open, and a familiar voice called out into the darkened apartment, startling me from my thoughts. It was my husband's son. He'd just returned from a long stint abroad, and though we had barely seen each other over the years, I was taken aback at how much he had changed. Standing in the doorway, he looked different, older, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "Hey, hope I'm not disturbing," he said, his voice calmed but a bit uncertain as he stepped inside, glancing around as if trying to remember the place. "No, not at all," I replied, gesturing to the seat across from me. Actually, I could use some company. He pulled out a chair, and we sat across from each other, the hum of the city below us filling the quiet space between our words. As we started to talk, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. It felt easy, natural, like slipping into an old familiar rhythm that had once brought comfort, but had been forgotten with time. We talked about everything and nothing, the people he'd met, the places he'd seen, the feeling of being home after so long. I listened, genuinely interested, letting his stories fill the quiet corners of my mind that had grown lonely and restless over the years. At one point he paused, his eyes catching mine, and there was a moment of silence that felt both comfortable and charged. Like the pause before the first note of a song. His gaze was steady, and for a brief, heart-stopping second, I forgot who I was, where I was, or even why he was here. The room seemed to shrink around us, the silence thickening into something I couldn't quite name. I don't know what came over me, but suddenly, almost instinctively, I leaned across the table. It was the lightest, most fleeting touch, hardly more than a whisper against his lips. Yet it held a weight that lingered in the air, binding us in an unspoken understanding. The touch was gone as quickly as it had come, and when I pulled back, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Guilt, surprise, and something deeper that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He blinked, looking at me as though seeing me for the first time, and I could see 1,000 thoughts flashing across his expression. But he didn't say a word. He simply stood, hesitated as if wanting to speak, and then without a sound, he turned and walked toward his room, leaving me alone once more. As the door closed softly behind him, the reality of what had just happened washed over me, and I felt my heart racing in a way it hadn't in years. There, in the stillness of the night, I was left to sit with the storm of emotions I had unwittingly unleashed, wondering what this would mean for both of us, and what uncharted territory we had just stepped into. The next morning, he avoided me. Every time I tried to catch his eye, he would turn away, his face unreadable. It was as if last night hadn't happened, but I knew that wasn't true. Knew he felt the weight of that fleeting touch just as much as I did. I tried to distract myself, going through my usual routine, but my mind kept returning to that moment in the dimly lit kitchen. It wasn't something I could easily shake off, and I was beginning to wonder if I even wanted to. The day dragged on, and the empty silence of the apartment pressed in on me. My husband was away on business, as usual, and the familiar loneliness that I had grown used to now felt different, sharper, edged with a tension that I couldn't ignore. I wondered if he felt the same. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard his footsteps approaching, tentative and slow, as if he was unsure of whether he should come closer. We met in the hallway. He hesitated, glancing down at the floor, avoiding my gaze. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. "I think we should talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it seemed to echo in the quiet space between us. He looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since the night before. "Yeah," he replied, his voice as soft as mine. "I think we should." We ended up sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, the same place where it had all begun. The tension between us was palpable, like a rope pulled too tight, threatening to snap at any moment. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I could see he was struggling to find the right words, just as I was. My hands fidgeted on the table, fingers nervously tracing the edge of my coffee cup. Finally, he broke the silence. I didn't expect any of this, he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Last night, it surprised me. I nodded, my gaze falling to the cup in front of me. It surprised me too, I admitted, feeling a strange sense of relief in voicing the truth. I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't even know what it means. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say something, but he held back, glancing away. His expression conflicted. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he was caught between what he thought he should feel and what he actually did feel. The same war was raging within me. I wanted to reach across the table to break the distance between us, but I knew it wasn't that simple. I don't know what to think, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but I can't ignore it. I can't just pretend it didn't happen. His words hung in the air, charged with a weight that neither of us could deny. I nodded slowly, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe we don't have to pretend, I said, surprised at my own boldness, at the words spilling out before I could stop them. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. In that moment, the unspoken tension that had been building between us became almost unbearable. Without thinking, I reached across the table, my hand finding his. It was a simple touch, but it felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. For a long moment we sat there, the silence heavy with all the things we couldn't say. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared in the hallway, he pulled his hand back, breaking the connection between us. I should go, he said, his voice strained. He stood up, and I could see the conflict written all over his face. He was torn, just as I was, caught between what was right and what felt impossible to resist. Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hall, as he disappeared into his room, leaving me alone once again. But this time, the emptiness felt different. The quiet of the apartment seemed to press down on me, as if the very walls knew the secrets that had just been shared. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't something I could ignore. It wasn't something either of us could ignore. As the minutes ticked by, I realized with a growing sense of dread that this was only the beginning. I'd woken up that morning determined to shake off the lingering emotions from the previous day. I decided I needed a bit of fresh air, a way to clear my mind, so I dug out my running clothes, hoping a long jog would help settle my thoughts. Pulling open my closet, I tried to focus on the simple routine of dressing and lacing up my shoes, letting it distract me from everything that had been clouding my head. I was in the middle of changing into my workout gear, pulling a loose sweatshirt over my head, when the door to my room swung open. He stepped inside, eyes down on his phone, not realizing he'd walked right in on me. We both froze, time seeming to stand still for a moment as we took in the scene. Oh, sorry. His face turned red as he quickly averted his gaze, stepping back toward the door. I didn't mean to. I couldn't help but laugh at his flustered expression, the way he seemed utterly taken aback by his own mistake. You know, usually people knock before entering a room. I teased lightly, trying to put him at ease. Didn't anyone teach you that rule? His embarrassment only deepened, and for a split second, I was the one caught off guard. I hadn't expected him to look so genuinely mortified over such a simple thing. His eyes stayed glued to the floor, as though he was too embarrassed to even glance my way. Right, of course, I just forgot. I should have. He stumbled over his words, then finally seemed to compose himself, managing a sheepish smile. I'll, leave you to it then, he said, backing out of the room as quickly as he'd entered, softly closing the door behind him. I watched the door for a moment after he'd left, a strange mix of emotions settling over me. His reaction had surprised me more than I wanted to admit. It was almost as though the air between us had shifted. A subtle change I couldn't quite put my finger on. For the rest of the morning, I tried to shake off the memory, telling myself it was nothing more than a simple mishap, a momentary lapse in normal boundaries. But as I pulled on my running shoes and headed out the door, the thought lingered, teasing the edges of my mind. The day passed quietly, the usual stillness of the apartment wrapping around me like a familiar weight. I hadn't seen him since our awkward encounter that morning, and I found myself wondering if he was trying to avoid me. Maybe he'd felt the same strange shift I had, that unspoken tension that had been building since last night. I was halfway through tidying up the living room when I heard his footsteps behind me. He hovered in the doorway for a moment, seeming unsure if he should enter. I looked up, giving him a small, encouraging smile, hoping to ease the tension that had seemed to settle between us. "Hey," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "About this morning, I just wanted to say sorry again." I waved a hand, dismissing his apology. "Don't worry about it. It was nothing," I replied, my tone light. "Things like that happen. No harm done, right?" He nodded, but his expression remained serious, as though he was searching for the right words. "Yeah, I know. It's just, well, things feel a little different lately." I don't really know how to explain it. I understood what he meant, even if neither of us could quite put it into words. The air between us seemed charged with a kind of electricity. Something subtle but impossible to ignore. And though I knew I should keep my distance, maintain the boundaries that had kept us safe this time I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. As he spoke, his gaze softened, and I felt that familiar pull, that quiet force drawing us together despite everything. And before I could think better of it, I stepped closer, letting the space between us disappear. I didn't know what I was doing or why. It was like we were caught in a current neither of us could resist. Our eyes met, and in that moment the silence spoke volumes. There were 1,000 reasons why this shouldn't happen, why we needed to stop, but none of them mattered in that instant. Without a word, we leaned closer and our lips met in the briefest, softest of touches. As soon as it was over, I took a step back, my heart pounding as reality settled back in. He looked at me, eyes wide with a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite name. We stood there, caught in the aftermath of that fleeting moment, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, he broke the silence. I should probably go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of regret and relief as he turned and left the room. Once again, I was left alone, the quiet settling over me as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The days that followed were a tense dance of silence and glances. Each morning, I'd find myself expecting to run into him in the hallway or the kitchen, but he kept his distance, lingering only in doorways and leaving rooms before I entered. I tried to convince myself that this was for the best, that maybe he was just as confused as I was, that perhaps we both needed some space to sort out our tangled feelings. And yet with every passing day, the silence only seemed to draw me in deeper, as though an invisible thread kept pulling us back, together. One evening when my husband was out late for a work dinner, I was lying on the couch, absent-mindedly scrolling through channels on the TV, barely aware of the sounds and lights flashing in front of me. The room was dim, the soft glow from the city lights seeping through, the windows casting shadows across the walls. I had almost dozed off when I heard footsteps, approaching, tentative and slow as though he was hesitant to disturb me. He paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. "Is it all right if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft, as though he was afraid of breaking the fragile peace that hung between us. I nodded, scooting over to make room for him on the couch. We sat in silence, neither of us daring to speak, the unspoken tension filling the space between us like an invisible barrier. The sound of the television buzzed in the background, a muffled distraction, but neither of us paid it any attention. I could feel his presence beside me, the warmth radiating from him, and it was both comforting and unsettling all at once. After a while, he broke the silence. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" he said, his voice barely above a hey, "being here like this, after everything." I nodded, unable to find the right words. My mind was a jumble of emotions, and I didn't trust myself to speak without revealing more than I intended. Instead, I simply looked at him, trying to convey through my gaze what I couldn't say, aloud. He met my eyes, and in that moment it was as if all the barriers we'd built between us crumbled. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. It was a small gesture, almost innocent, yet it felt like crossing a line that we couldn't step back over. He didn't pull, instead he turned his hand, letting his fingers intertwine with mine. The touch was simple, but it felt charged with a meaning that went far beyond words. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching on, neither of us willing to break the fragile connection. And then slowly he leaned in, his face inches from mine. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause that seemed to hang in the air, and I could feel my heart racing. caught between fear and something else, something I couldn't name. Our lips met in the briefest of touches, a soft, hesitant kiss that was over almost before it began. But even in that fleeting moment, I felt a surge of emotion, a longing that had been buried for far too long. When we pulled back, I looked away, a wave of guilt washing over me. What were we doing? This was a path we had no business going down, and yet I couldn't deny the pull. The feeling that something irrevocable had changed between us. He seemed to sense my turmoil, his gaze steady, reassuring. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "But I can't ignore what's happening. It's like there's something between us, and it's only getting stronger." I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I know, but it's complicated. So many people could get hurt." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand, but that doesn't change how I feel. And I don't think it changes how you feel either." I looked at him, my heart pounding as I realized he was right. There was no denying what had happened between us, no pretending it was just a passing feeling. Whatever this was, it had taken root deep inside, and ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. But the weight of reality pressed down on me, reminding me of all the reasons why this was wrong. In the end, he left the room quietly, as though sensing my need for space. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief and longing, caught in the throes of emotions I couldn't control. Once again, I was left alone with my thoughts, the quiet hum of the television filling the empty space. As the door clicked shut behind him, I knew this was only the beginning. A week later, my husband suggested we take a short trip to the cabin by the lake, a quiet getaway from the city that had always been our family's sanctuary. I felt a familiar warmth at the thought of it, remembering weekends spent fishing, cooking over the open fire, and listening to the gentle rustling of the trees. It was a place full of memories, ones I cherished and now felt strangely uneasy about revisiting. He seemed to think it would be a refreshing break, a chance for us all to reconnect, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. We packed the car early in the morning, loading it with groceries, warm clothes, and everything needed for a quiet weekend in the woods. The drive was long and winding, the trees growing denser as we moved further from the city. He sat quietly in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, while my husband chatted about upcoming projects, trips, and plans he had been making. I kept my focus on the road, trying to ignore the strange tension that seemed to settle over us, thick as the morning fog that hung in the air. When we arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered it. A cozy wooden structure nestled at the edge of the lake, surrounded by towering. I breathed in the crisp, clean air, hoping it would clear the cloud of confusion in my mind. We spent the day settling in, unpacking bags and getting the fireplace going, and soon the familiar smell of wood smoke filled the room. I told myself I could handle this, that whatever had passed between us in the city would fade here in the peaceful solitude of the cabin. But as evening fell and shadows lengthened, the quiet of the cabin seemed to amplify everything I was trying to push down. We were all gathered in the small living room, the only light coming from the crackling fire. My husband was telling a story from his college days, his voice loud and cheerful, filling the room. I was barely listening, my mind distracted, my gaze drifting toward him. He caught my eye once, a fleeting glance that held more than I could put into words. I quickly looked away, feeling a surge of guilt, yet unable to ignore the pull. After dinner, my husband suggested we go for a walk by the lake. It was an old tradition of ours, one I usually looked forward to. But tonight, I felt a reluctance I couldn't quite explain. The air was cool and still, the moonlight casting long shadows over the water. We walked in silence, the only sounds our footsteps crunching on the gravel path. My husband took my hand, his grip warm and familiar, but I couldn't shake the sense of distance, as if I was walking beside a stranger. When we returned to the cabin, he excused himself, saying he had some work calls to make, leaving the two of us alone. I watched him disappear into the other room, my heart pounding as I realized we were truly alone for the first time since arriving. The quiet felt different now, heavier, charged with a tension that had been building since we'd left the city. I found myself standing by the window, looking out over the lake, feeling his presence beside me, close enough that I could feel his warmth. "Do you remember the last time we were here?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded, my gaze still fixed on the dark water. "It was a long time ago," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, his shoulder brushing mine, a subtle touch that sent a shiver down my spine. "Things were simpler then," he said, his tone heavy with something unspoken. "Everything feels different now." I glanced up at him, meeting his eyes in the dim light. I could see the same emotions reflected there. The same confusion, the same pull. Maybe things aren't as different as they seem. I said my words surprising even myself. For a moment we stood there in silence, caught between what we felt and what we knew was right. It would have been easy to close the gap, to let the unspoken emotions between us take over. But just as I felt myself leaning into that possibility, a door creaked open behind us, and my husband's voice called out. "Hey, everything all right out here?" he asked, his tone light and casual, yet carrying in there undertone of curiosity. I stepped back, putting distance between us, feeling my heart race as if I'd been caught doing something forbidden. "Yes, of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just enjoying the view?" He nodded, glancing between us for a moment before disappearing back into the other room. I felt a wave of relief mixed with disappointment, knowing that the moment was gone, yet grateful for the reminder of the boundaries we'd been so close to crossing. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning with everything that had happened. The quiet of the cabin seemed almost oppressive, a constant reminder of the line I couldn't cross, no matter how strong the pull. The next morning, the cabin was shrouded in a dense fog that hung heavy over the lake, casting an eerie, muted glow over everything. My husband decided to go out for an early hike, leaving me alone in the quiet cabin. I knew he'd be gone for hours, and though I welcomed the solitude, a part of me couldn't ignore the flutter of anxiety stirring inside. I found myself drifting toward the window, watching as the fog wrapped around the trees, thick and impenetrable. I didn't hear him approach, but when I turned, he was standing in the doorway, his expression a mirror of the unease I felt. We stood in silence for a moment, the tension between us almost tangible, as though the fog outside had seeped into the room and a while clouded our judgment, blurring the lines of reason. He stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought he'd never leave. He said, his tone laced with something I couldn't name, a mix of relief, hesitation, and an undercurrent of something forbidden. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and I felt my heart race in response, a familiar tug pulling me closer. I took a step back, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. We shouldn't," I stammered, the words faltering as my resolve began to waver. I wanted to be strong, to hold on to the boundaries we'd been so careful to maintain. But in that quiet room, with only the sound of our breathing filling the space, my defenses felt paper-thin. He took another step forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "Maybe not," he murmured, his voice low and steady, as though he were confessing a secret he'd kept hidden for too long. But that doesn't change the fact that his words trailed off, but I understood him perfectly. The emotions that had been building between us, simmering just beneath the surface, were now bubbling over, refusing to be ignored. I could feel the walls of the cabin closing in around us, the fog pressing against the windows, a silent witness to the choices we were on the verge of making. Just as he reached out, his fingers grazing mine, a loud knock echoed through the cabin, shattering the silence. We both froze, our eyes widening in shock as the sound reverberated through the room. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding as the reality of the situation came crashing down on us. My husband's voice called out from the other side of the door, his tone cheerful, oblivious to the tension that had filled the room. "Are you two in there?" I thought I'd stop by the cabin before heading to the lake. I forced myself to take a deep breath, the panic rising in my chest as I struggled to regain control. "Yes, we're here," I called out, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. He gave me a look, a silent question in his eyes, and I shook my head slightly, a warning not to say anything. This was a line we couldn't cross, no matter how strong the pull. The door creaked open, and my husband stepped inside, smiling as he glanced between us. For a moment I feared he could see through me, that he could sense the storm raging beneath my carefully composed exterior. But his expression remained unchanged, his smile warm and genuine, as though he had no idea of the turmoil that had nearly consumed us just moments before. He walked over, slipping his arm around my shoulders in a familiar, comforting gesture. "I'm glad we're all here together," he said, his voice filled with a contentment that felt foreign, almost jarring in the wake of what had nearly happened. "This place holds so many memories, doesn't it?" I nodded, forcing a smile as I looked up at him, trying to push the lingering guilt and confusion out of my mind. But as his gaze drifted back to the lake, lost in a nostalgic reverie, I felt his presence beside me, a silent reminder of everything we hadn't said, everything we had left unresolved. The day passed slowly, each moment dragging with the weight of what had almost happened. I found myself stealing glances at him, each look filled with questions that I knew would never have answers. We moved through the motions of the day, pretending that everything was as it should be. But beneath the surface, the tension simmered, a constant reminder of the choices we had made and the ones we hadn't. As evening fell and the shadows lengthened once more, we gathered around the fire, my husband telling stories as he always did, his voice filling the quiet cabin with warmth and laughter. But I could feel his gaze on me, a silent connection that refused to be broken, even as I tried to focus on the familiar comfort of my husband's presence. And then, just as the fire began to die down, he turned to me, his expression unreadable, his voice barely a whisper. "What are we going to do?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge, a test of my resolve. I didn't answer, couldn't answer. The truth was I didn't know.